In 1495, the 43-year-old Leonardo was hired to decorate the dining room in the small Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan. The theme would be Christ's last meal with his disciples. It was for this modest wall decoration that Leonardo would create the most ingenious composition in the history of art. He worked slowly, passionately on the painting. At one point, the prior began to badger him. Leonardo retorted that the delay was because he couldn't find a model for Judas. He then asked the prior to pose for the one who betrayed Christ. The suggestion was enough to quiet the prior's complaints, and he left Leonardo to finish. When he did, the result was nothing short of revolutionary. No painting would be so immortal as this, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper.
Leonardo's genius is to say, how do I capture the significant moment when Christ says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you that one of you will betray me," and psychological hell breaks loose.
Betrayal was a sin referred to often in Leonardo's notebooks, perhaps reflections of his feelings about his trial for sodomy in Florence 20 years before. No wonder the story of Judas affected him so powerfully.
Leonardo tried to represent the figures in a very natural, human way, to represent in actions and in attitudes the inner movement of the mind.
Instead of lining up everybody in a row, which was basically the way it had been done for the previous 100 or so years, Leonardo subdivided the 13 figures into 5 groups. 4 groups of 3 for the apostles, and then Christ isolated as a separate group. And that was a very remarkable innovation, much more comprehensible.
Leonardo wanted to paint slowly, so he rejected the usual fresco technique of painting onto wet plaster and experimented. He mixed oils and tempera directly onto the wall. The experiment failed. Soon after the painting was finished, the paint began to flake away.
Leonardo is accused of having used poor technique in the execution of the Last Supper. That is probably not altogether fair. The damage came from underground humidity that entered into the walls, and almost nobody has control of that.
With the arrival of the 16th century, Leonardo's services as portrait painter were very much in demand with Italy's noble ladies. But the commissions held little interest for him. When one lady sent a messenger to find out why he had not finished her portrait, the messenger reported back that Leonardo seemed weary of the paintbrush. Only one painting, a religious commission, held Leonardo's interest. In 1501, he began a sketch of the Virgin sitting on the lap of her mother, St. Anne, and reaching down to the Christ child. With this painting, Leonardo won the unqualified admiration of the Florence art world, which had so ignored him in his earlier days. But once again, although he worked on it for 8 or 9 years, Leonardo did not finish the work. Once again, his mind was elsewhere. What was consuming Leonardo's interest more and more was the flight of birds. He spent hours observing them.
The bird is an instrument functioning according to mathematical laws, and man has the power to reproduce an instrument like this with all its movement.
I don't know if you've ever looked at a bird flying, but it's impossible to tell the way the wing moves, for example. He could see how the wing moves and also draw it at the same time.
Leonardo dreamed of creating a machine to imitate the flight of birds, and beginning in 1495, even strapped wings on assistants and had them attempt flight. But finding a way to power a flying machine was always a great problem.
He starts out thinking that maybe we can flap, right? And comes to realize that that is really not possible. He's studying birds, but more than that, he's studying bats. And he finally comes up with the whole notion of gliding.
Leonardo also drew a machine much like our modern helicopter. But it was an idea, not an invention, and if constructed, probably would not have left the ground. Still, the range of Leonardo's technical imagination is astounding. He drew all kinds of devices in use in some form today, from parachutes to bicycles, with details that prefigure the modern versions. This crude sketch made by an assistant shows the all-important bicycle chain. On this same page is a prankish phallic cartoon and the name Salai, an assistant who joined Leonardo's workshop in 1490 at the age of 10. The name Salai was Leonardo's nickname for him and means limb of Satan. Despite the boy's somewhat tender age, he apparently became one of Leonardo's lovers.
Salai was a beautiful young boy that Leonardo took in his studio when he was 10, 11. And Leonardo took him probably just because he was very handsome, but he could use for a model first. I mean, he was a very poor painter, he'd never learned a lot, so probably he posed for Leonardo, maybe more than that. We have no certainty.
Salai stayed in Leonardo's workshop. Indeed, he was one of the few chosen to travel with Leonardo for the rest of his life. Leonardo, now 50 years old, was becoming a bit restless. He began to cast about for a new patron. In 1502, the powerful Duke Cesar Borgia, sketched here by Leonardo, took him on as a military engineer. Borgia was a ruthless warrior who had set out to conquer all of central Italy, and he must have been intrigued by Leonardo's designs for all kinds of brutal war machines, including giant crossbows, a moving tank, and a primitive machine gun. One drawing is of a scythe or spinning wheel of blades.
The nature of these offensive weapons, let's call them, is rather fanciful. And one really wonders whether there were serious proposals.
Leonardo did design war machines. He did design fortifications. But that's what every engineer designed in the Renaissance.
In 1503, Leonardo returned to his old home, Florence. His reputation had been so enhanced by his years in Milan that Florence now received him with open arms. But, famous as he was, there was another, younger artist who was at center stage here. And Michelangelo did not share the limelight gladly.
Michelangelo and Leonardo were rivals, but at the same time they appreciate each other's work. Leonardo did the sketch of Michelangelo's David, and Michelangelo at the same time did a drawing of Leonardo's Battle of Anghiari.
They were so different one from the other. Leonardo was a courtman, handsome, at ease in all situations. Michelangelo was a solitary man, quite bitter already.
One day, Leonardo was asked to explain a certain passage of Dante. He saw his rival across the square and said, "Here comes Michelangelo, he can explain it to you." But Michelangelo turned and snapped, "Explain it yourself, you who made a model of a horse you could never cast in bronze and which you gave up to your shame, and the stupid people of Milan trusted you." In October 1503, when Niccolò Machiavelli was a young and powerful official in the Florentine government, Leonardo was hired to decorate the city council chamber. This would be by far the biggest commission Leonardo ever had. The mural would commemorate Florence's victory in the Battle of Anghiari. The opposite wall was to be painted by Leonardo's chief rival, Michelangelo. Leonardo worked on the project for 3 long years and then, as he had done so often before, left it unfinished. It is unknown why Leonardo stopped his work. Perhaps Michelangelo's taunt about the unfinished horse hit home. Perhaps he felt he was too old for such a rivalry.
Florence was too small for both of them. It was one or the other. They couldn't work at the same time in the same place.
In 1506, perhaps recognizing that Florence was now Michelangelo's city, Leonardo prepared to leave it for a second time. But first, he received a commission from a wealthy Florentine merchant. The man wanted a portrait of his young wife, Mona Lisa.